the challenges around climate, flood, drought, heat waves and all that is a global challenge. Failures don't happen one at a time. You may imagine an urban area. Failures may happen at the same time, sequential. It can come in different shape and form. When an interdependent asset fails, the impact of that failure will be cascaded. The whole essence of resilience looks into the fact that we accept failure as part of the system. It's not about being tough. It is about being adaptive, being a bit flexible and ready to change when needed.
That is Maryam Imani, Associate Professor of Water Systems Engineering at Anglia Ruskin University in the UK. Maryam's early childhood fascination for building things led her to initially pursue a structural engineering career in Iran. After 3 years in practice, she pivoted back to academia into the world of water and critical infrastructure. Now based in the UK, Maryam is developing a deeper understanding of just how interdependent urban infrastructures are, what this means for resilience to global challenges, and where urban nature-based solutions can help in reducing our city's vulnerability. My name is Peter Marcus Bach, and this is the Grand Challenges Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to tackle the global challenges that our world is facing in their own unique ways. We reflect on the many out-of-the-box ways our guests have navigated the complexity and intricacies of our environment at the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology, and design. On today's show, Maryam and I explore the different dimensions and definitions of resilience as it applies to critical infrastructure, urban society, and personal development. We uncover just how interlinked our water, energy, and transport systems are, how she has been guiding municipalities towards improving their resilience, comparisons between planning in the global north and south, and the important role that nature-based solutions will play in the coming decades. Visit tgcpodcast.show for detailed information and show notes on this episode. Thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy the show. Welcome to the show, Maryam.
Thank you very much.
It's lovely to have you here today. Is this your first podcast?
It is my indeed first podcast and quite excited. And it's the first experience. And looking forward to that. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no worries. I know excitement is an understatement. You were very thrilled when I asked you to come onto the show back in December when we finally met in person in 3D.
Absolutely.
In Thailand.
No, absolutely. It was quite an experience. I knew you for a while. Again, publications, different occasions, events and all of that. But it was great. Actually, it was in NbS cluster. We met first time in one meeting and then the follow-up conversation during the Water Congress in Thailand, which was great.
And yeah, I mean, NbS topic close to my heart, and we haven't had it for a while on the show, so it's great to revisit that again. It was the dominant topic at the start of the show.
Absolutely.
So yeah, but you know, first impressions are always different from the person itself. I mean, when I first met you on one of these virtual calls for this nature-based solutions cluster, you know, you were very formal, but also still very lighthearted and easygoing. But from getting to know you more, I think the key word silent but deadly also comes into play.
Oh.
And that is because you have passions for a few things, in particular Taekwondo, which I've done myself.
Ooh. Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Another common interest.
Yeah. Well, it's been a while. I gave up after a while, but I did do it as a child. What's your experience with Taekwondo?
Well, I was very young, I would say, around age 13. I grew up in a very sporty family. My parents, especially my dad, were very sporty. My brother was very sporty. And I was very really liked something that seemed masculine at the time. I grew up, I was 13 years old, and I really wanted a career in sport. Although I was doing good in school, but 13 years old I was. And up to, I would say, 21 year old, almost 9 years, I carried on.
9 years, wow.
9 years. So from my teenage time to early youth, I was doing it, and with passion. 2-3 times a week, going to gym and then practicing, exercising and all of that. For 2 years, I was part of the national team. At the time, was a new thing. The women's team where it was formed. We didn't do any much international competitions, but some serious competition organized we did it. But I've done up to national competition. I have around 8 or 9 medals, silver mainly, a couple of times gold and 1 bronze. So, and it was something I was seeing myself, establishing myself in that space. But because at the time I was towards the end, I was an undergrad civil engineering student, clashing all the time, all these championships and these like camps we had to go to prepare for the championships or any competitions. It was time consuming, sometimes on other cities, clashing with exams. So eventually I came to a very difficult decision that perhaps I need to make a priority for my study here. And I left it and I never picked it up again, unfortunately. But I remained a passionate person about Taekwondo, and then I tried to follow up competitions and all that. That's close to my heart.
Interesting. I never went that seriously into Taekwondo.
Yeah.
It was more of a hobby thing. And I guess, my parents also gave me the chance because they wanted me to know how to defend myself.
Oh, yes. Actually, that's a good reason.
It's true. Although I think lately it's more about defending yourself verbally than physically. But nevertheless.
Indeed. But it was giving me a sense of confidence. Quite a lot. I was quite confident. My parents allowed me to experience. My dad was always saying, sky is your limit. Yeah. So you can dream as you wish, but take responsibility for that. So that's how it happened.
Out of curiosity, and for the listeners who know how Taekwondo's stages works, what's the highest level you reached before you decided to stop?
Yes, you've got different belts, obviously. Mm-hmm. When you are a fresher, you start with white and then gradually move to yellow, to green, to blue, to red, and to black. And then from black to you step into a sort of like a mastership level. You start with Dan 1, 2, 3, up to, I think, 8. I went to black belt and then Dan 1. I've done that. But, assessments are a bit difficult and hard. And then you need the Central Federation at the time had to come in and they test you and they certify you and things like that. So I went up to that level. I was quite young, but I didn't continue. Those that they started with me, I think they end up, I think I see them sometimes they're in charge of women team at the time, or some of them are world champions and things like that, or training the younger generation. But I was stopped there. But that's the process.
It's a really big organization. I remember the examiners came in from
South Korea. And
they would really, it worked like clockwork. Lots of people then wanting to take the exams and
absolutely. Yeah. It was quite stressful. People coming from South Korea, to assess that, quite nervous and quite stressful. But when you're younger, you get excited about that and you accommodate all that stress. Yeah.
It was something that my dad had fun in spending time with me doing. So he would bring me to the exams and I would see him chill on the stands while I'd be subjected to
championship.
To a lot of physical stress.
No, absolutely. And then show us what you've learned. It gave us a great sense of, again, confidence, concentration, and of course, apart from the physically you're prepared, I think mentally it tries to prepare you. And a lot of mental exercise comes, that spirituality aspect comes with it, which I think it's an important thing.
But it builds discipline as well internally.
Absolutely. Discipline, absolutely. Respect, discipline, and all of that.
No pain, no gain.
Yeah, absolutely. No pain, no gain. Yeah, absolutely.
And aside from Taekwondo, you also have a passion for motorbikes.
Yeah.
Could you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah. You would be amazed at how later stages of your life you develop new interests and hobbies. Motorbike came at later stages of my life, although somehow it was part of it, indirectly, I would say. My brother was a passionate motorcyclist. He was professional doing it and all of that. And I lost my brother in a motorbike accident while practicing and all of that. Psychologically, it became a no-go zone to start. I was in my early 20s when that happened. So it becomes a thing that you wouldn't imagine you find yourself or you have interest in it. So you sort of try to lock it in a room and that's it. But gradually, over the past couple of years, I would say, my husband also is a passionate about motorbikes and all of that. But that was something we agreed on. You're not going to do that.
Okay.
But gradually things changed. And I started looking into that. I wasn't unfamiliar. Again, I'm said my brother was very much in it. And then here we go. He got the license and got the motorbike. And it took a bit of time to convince me to sit as a pillion. And I remember it was a couple of years ago when I sat first time as a pillion, for me, was the hardest thing I had ever done. So
I can imagine,
I was dragged from my comfort zone that I've been living in it for a while to sit there and then imagining myself in that position. But the motorbike was great. We had a tour around. The motorbike is a Triumph Rocket 3 GT. So it's a big motorbike, very powerful. So but the ride is quite comfortable. It's a grand tour. So it's a different experience. And I gradually got to love it. And I've reached a point, and I attend exhibitions, and I'm thinking of getting a license myself, although I may not say my parents, but I'm thinking of getting a license myself. Yeah, we've done tours around, again, a road trip to Dover, Calais, and Normandy, France, and all of that. I've attended the Distinguished Gentleman's Right, which is part of the movement. It's a charity, promotes men's health. Last year I attended, and we will attend this year too, around men's health, I think mental health and prostate cancer. I think these are the two ones they focus. So we support all the men in our life. I'm part of it. And also I'm part of, associate member, I'm becoming part of these Red Night groups. It's a charity is a global thing, focuses on blue light people, primarily firefighters who retire and all of that. It's a charity for them, supporting them and their families, but it could be army veterans, police, and generally blue light, but focus are on firefighters. My dad is a retired fire officer. My husband is a fire engineer, and he's also was a fire officer before that. So I have any reason to be part of this group. So, but that was something I discovered as I go. So yeah, that's my midlife crisis.
Yeah.
Adventure.
Midlife crisis. To me, just hearing the story, and thanks for sharing that moment of vulnerability and also struggle.
It came out of it.
It's tough to lose a family member and to then somehow find, I guess, that liberation from the trauma, that's what it sounds like. It's an incredible journey, especially the moment when you first sat on the motorbike.
Yes, Peter. It's sometimes you need to run towards your fears in order to discover change, basically. And in that process, you develop capabilities. I would label it as resilience, individual you discover in yourself. That new capabilities, new dimensions of your character you would discover that you wouldn't have imagined. So that limit, that fear is in your head.
Yeah.
But once you face it on the ground, you action on that, you would be amazed how capable you are. And human being generally, I believe, has got enormous, unlimited capacity to face the fear. Just make up your mind and sit on that motorbike, and things will emerge. New things happen. And I think that's what I'm discovering at the moment.
It's a powerful message, I think, for our listeners to take to heart. And believe it or not, you also said the key word that will frame a lot of today's discussion as well, and the topic. So not just nature-based solutions, but specifically the word resilience.
Absolutely.
What better way to begin than with human resilience?
No, absolutely.
Yeah. So, when we think nature-based solutions and we think resilience, we think infrastructures, you said already you were a civil engineer, but you didn't actually work in nature-based solutions from the get-go. You actually started in structural engineering. I sense a similarity between us again. When I first started civil engineering, I also was interested in structures and only went to water later on. But tell me your journey. How did you go from deciding to do engineering to then structures? And then finally to, in this case, water and nature-based solutions.
My career choice and where I am wasn't something that I would say I had projected organically happen. In fact, it didn't go that way at all. I first wanted and had a passion to become a pilot. I loved to be a pilot. So I loved an adventurous life, which for various reasons, it didn't happen. But I always loved engineering, building things. The passion for Legos I have comes from that. The early childhood, the birthday present that you get, that it changes your life forever. And that passion I had for building things and hands-on.
It's funny how, this happens on the podcast over and over again, but we seem to have these recurring trends. And we just had last year a discussion of fashion multiple times on the show across guests. We had donut economics as well show up almost, side by side. And in this case, this year, I sense the trend is Lego, because we just had that inspiration from Lego also from another guest on episode 57.
Really?
So
there we go.
Serendipity in, how the guests flock to the podcast. but please do keep going.
Sure. So yes, the passion for playing with Legos, I got it when I was very young. I don't know, 5 years old or maybe 6. I can't remember. But a big box of Legos I've got that I could make buildings, bridges, all sorts of structures I could make. And I still have them. And I was enjoying it. And I was sometimes watching things finished and all of that. It was quite mesmerizing. And time when I grew up, we didn't have the internet, all these fancy gadgets. You could see things everywhere. So we were cherishing and valuing a lot whenever we were getting something to play with. And I think that was helping our imagination, creativity, was because you had to think about it. You had to picture something envision something in your head and then make it. And that was exactly how I grew. I am very good in imagination, visualization in my head. Maybe that played a role, but Legos were, I would say, the cornerstone of it.
Okay.
But then gradually, when I got to university, I knew what I don't want. For example, I was never a fan of doing chemistry or doing electrical and things like that. I was never a fan of. I loved civil from day one. And then how my journey started. So I did a civil engineering degree, 4 years. I was a good student, I would say. Very good in geotechnics, structural side. Water was fine. It wasn't a dominated subject. And it didn't happen to me that is something I will eventually end up with at all. So when I finished my undergrad, my plan was always, I would love to be a CEO of my own company. I'm going to do industry, practice, consultancy. That was the plan for sure. And that's what I did. As soon as I graduated, with a couple of friends, relatives, we started a company. We got 2 projects. Actually, one was a school, primary school. Another one was a refurbishment of a bank, which I was quite hands-on, quite site-based, but a bit of site and also a bit of office. And I learned quite a lot. I did placements in construction site, and I really liked that masculinity, toughening up, around it. And again, the time when I was very young in my 20s, which I had a passion for 2 years of being in that company and doing that. I didn't take even one day off. Everything was dominated, and I was doing it passionately, early morning to late evening.
Wow. Dedication.
It was a dedication. But eventually, I was very young and inexperienced. What happened is that for various reasons, I couldn't continue with it. It got to a point and that I felt this needs to stop. So I, left the company, but it came as, it wasn't an easy departure. In a sense, I labeled it as a failure at the time. And
really?
I had, 3-4 months of downtime. I saw that as a failure. My peers progressed to different stages of their career. And I went back. I felt at the time I went back to point zero. So a few months of downtime, but gradually pulled myself together and started studying again for doing a master at university. And water was one of the areas I picked at the time. I had no clue how things going to work, but those 2 years of before master, I work as a structural engineer. At the time, even I started planning for my charter trip as a structure. Structure is still, I love it. I know a lot about it. I can teach a structure, in fact. But water happened when I started my master degree. And I, at the same time where I studied, I started working, the professor I was working on my dissertation had a center, it's called Water and Environmental Research Center. So I managed to get involved and work with a lot of PhDs, smart, talented PhDs, researchers, postdocs, and also other master students, all focused on water and environment. And that was a changing moment for me that this area exists. But that paved the way towards a PhD and then a career in water. But that wasn't something I had planned to be an academic, and being in water, that wasn't something I had projected.
I mean, you had the dream of being the CEO of your own company, which you basically tried and you just went for it. And I guess we should add to this was all in Iran at the time.
Yes,
so
at the time.
From what I understand, highly technical, and they really drilled the foundations into you. So you had that real strong knowledge around the fundamentals.
Yes.
And I guess with some practical experience, could I say that you grew a bit tired of the static things and wanted a bit more dynamic aspects?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, going back to this, I think during that experience of moving and transition of even mindset from a CEO of a company, I was seeing myself to a PhD and get the mind from mindset of an engineer to mindset of a researcher. They are two different things. Perhaps they complement each other. I realized failure, if you call it failure, as feedback rather than a verdict. Or I developed some resilience around that time too. So it's not about being tough. It is about being adaptive, being a bit flexible and ready to change where needed.
Yeah, I guess it's important in the mindset to keep that in the back of your head because, too easily, you get distracted by the thought of whether something is a failure or whether you can learn from it and use it to better your methods, better your outcomes. And then I guess the other difference between the mindset is, at least I know this from a research side of you, and I'm learning this now as part of the business side, is a researcher tends to move towards the perfectionist stage, always trying to, make the work more rigorous, more robust. There's always something that someone can critique and they have to make sure they cover the ground so that the work really stands on its own. Yes. Whereas I guess as a CEO, you need to focus on, making sure the job gets done.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, shifting between being an engineer or having an engineering mindset is deeply, I think, is pragmatic. And so engineers are very focused on what is the problem, what are the requirements, what are the limitations, how can I fix it more efficiently or safely or practically. Well, when you sort of move into a researcher mindset, is grounded in curiosity, as you said, and then perfectionism keep pushing things forward. Why does it happen? Can we try something else? Can we think differently? So in a sense, I think research sort of teaches us being patient, a bit more reflective, a willingness to sit down with complexity and be patient. I think it's a good description, but they both sort of complement each other. And for me, it was a shift of character, mindset and everything, moving from industry to academia.
Which is interesting because I'm doing the exact opposite shift, moving from research into industry. But nevertheless, Iran, so characteristic of water scarcity, semi-arid region, and you actually focused on flash floods in your master's thesis, which is quite interesting because now you're in the UK, you're at Anglia Ruskin University, and the UK is actually dealing more with flooding than droughts. So I guess fill in that final bit of how you got from Iran to the UK for me.
Sure, absolutely. In my master dissertation, yes, and I was involved in that research center, lots of projects around climate change was a thing at the time. And you're right, a lot of focus were around future predictions, drought management, quite a lot. Because again, water efficiency was a problem, aged infrastructure, inefficient networks, and in light, and also at the same time, low rainfall and all of that. I remember when I was growing up, there were times I lived around Tehran, and it's a mountainous city. We were getting the snow up to your knees. You could go ski up to your knees. And there were days that the schools were shut down because it was impossible to move around.
Oh, wow.
I bet current generation have any idea how snow looks like even, or what it is. But yes, at the time, I focused on a case study in the southeast, which is a very arid or semi-arid area that the rainfall is quite low. It may not happen even for years. And then when it comes, because the soil is very dry, it loses that capacity of infiltration. So water runs through. But there were a lot of local sort of indigenous people developed some skills how to store, harvest water from the flooding season for the dry periods, which was an interesting thing to listen and to watch. But yes, I worked around flood management in those areas, particularly two critical rivers around that area. But being part of that team, I attended a couple of conferences. And again, through those studies, literature review that we all do, I read quite a lot of work from Center for Water Systems in Exeter University. In particular, I read, because flood management, again, if you're familiar with Exeter Water Center, many people are, flooding is one of the themes, one of the areas that they have a lot of skill set, knowledge, and innovation happens there. So I applied for a PhD at Exeter University, Center for Water System. And in particular, I wanted to work with Dragan Savage and David Butler at the time.
Two very big names in the industry.
Two very big names, which I had the privilege to know and work with them.
We need to get them on the show at some point, actually. So if you're listening in, invitations open.
Yeah, fantastic. And then, I applied, got the scholarship from Exeter University, Centre for Water Systems, and I came to the UK. And there was a bit of change of plan. So my first supervisor became Zoran Kaplan, Delft University. If Zoran at some point may listen to this, hi Zoran.
Likewise.
Yeah.
Would love to have you on, Zoran.
Oh, fantastic. I look forward to that too. Zoran and then David. So I worked with Zoran and David, and they were the supervisors of my PhD, and I wish I had the privilege of working with them. And I learned quite a lot. This Exeter was one of those turning points in my life. Just moving to another continent, another country, working with such a global leading institute in that space. The bar is quite high. The expectation is quite high.
Can imagine,
so you have to really step up. It was challenging. There were times of disappointment, it was quite bumpy, you can imagine. Generally, that's the PhD journey. We all know that. But I learned quite a lot. I had the privilege of working with many leading researchers, practitioners in the center, and work with them. And as I said, I learned quite a lot. I was there from 2008 until 2015. Almost, I would say, 7-8 years I was there.
Wow.
And that's how my journey began. And I found myself a PhD in water.
PhD in water, and in particular, that keyword resilience has popped up quite a lot on the human side. As a structural engineer, you also have to deal with the topic of resilience. Then when we think about resilience in the environment, in an ecological sense, it's also, again, slightly nuanced and different. In fact, there are many theories around in the literature that actually talks about the differences between the resilience. But I guess, that's the one part of the picture. The other part, which I think is also very important that we often forget, is interdependency of infrastructure. And so I'd love to quickly open up the box a bit to give our listeners an idea of what is the meaning behind these two keywords in the context of infrastructure: interdependency and resilience.
Interdependency is something, it was an area I picked up when I started at Anglia Ruskin University. There was a call by Natural Environment Research Council, which looked into the impact of climate change on, they call it infrastructure resilience, which was a thing at the time. I'm talking about 2018 or 17 or 18, which basically all the infrastructure system in an urban area or peri-urban area that functions, that provide essential services, utilities, water, energy, transport, telecommunication, etc.
And we often call them critical infrastructure.
Critical infrastructure, absolutely. They are the lifeline, they are the backbone of society, day-to-day functioning of the cities, urban areas, and human life generally. And they are highly interconnected for their functionality. You will require energy. The whole water network requires energy for functioning of operating the assets, pumps, valves, etc., etc.
Yeah.
Or transport system highly depends on energy system, and all to telecommunication.
Yeah. And I suppose we often design the roads to convey large floodwaters in the case of a big rain event, because we can't just get big pipes, underground.
Absolutely.
It's not feasible.
Absolutely. And even for any intervention, you want to supply assets or maximize your redundancy, supply different assets to the depots for exactly intervening at time of crisis. You would need those roads on those accesses. So when you think about it, it's an extremely complex network. It's an extremely complex system. That's why you may not find many people or a lot of work around that, because it is complex. A lot of things is happening, but it's still an area needs to be developed. And in that call, in that seminar we attended with a colleague of mine, her expertise around the structure, transport, bridges, that kind. I was on the water side and we had a colleague on the energy side. When we attended this call, we realized, I'm speaking to a lot of water companies, people from water companies industry, energy, transport, telecommunication were in that space. We had a sort of like a chat with them around the challenge, and the issue of interdependency popped up, which super interested. The concept, the issue is interesting. When an interdependent asset fails, the impact of that failure will be cascaded, propagated in the interconnected network or networks. And it can affect many people and services in different ways. And with this simple concept, but inherently is quite complex, we decided to do a project.
And to really illustrate this in a real world, because you can think that, this would be just cascades makes kind of sense. If something fails, something else could fail. But how does this actually look like? And I believe that project allowed you to then go into a particular case study where a real flood happened. And this is, I'm talking about the 2002 Glasgow flooding in Scotland, which, just caused a whole wreak of havoc across the entire city. And so I guess it began with the floods.
Yes, the case study was a very good example of isolated communities when these failures happened. Argyll and Bute, yes, is part of Scotland. The case study area has got part in mainland. So through mainland could be supported, but there are 2 other islands that through ferry lines, they are getting connected. When there is a storm or flood or something.
So the broader region.
Yes, it's going to be completely disconnected from the mainland. At the same time in mainland as well. So we were dealing with 3 modes of transport. We had road, we had rail network, and the mainland, even inside the island. And also we had ferry. So 3 modes of transport. We had water and energy as well.
And so, in 2002, in Scotland, you had heavy rainfall, which, as I said, started with the floods, but that then cascaded into a whole range of other problems. That includes, flooding of the main highways, which then disrupted the traffic, but it also flooded the subways, so people couldn't even get to work. And what made things worse was that the maintenance crews and repair crews couldn't actually get to the sites where the problems were to try and rectify the infrastructure. So we spoke about how roads are used as emergency channels. They definitely worked in that case, but it definitely disrupted something else. And from what I understand, the floods could have also hit a critical substation that was very close to where it was happening. And if that had happened, energy would have gone out, and the pumps that would have pumped water out of the subway tunnels would not have been able to do so, right? So I think they narrowly avoided a serious disaster.
Absolutely. In case of Scotland, one single event alone, imagine not an extreme, can cause failure. You may not see it in a cascaded fashion. It become a disaster when all these hazards, one cascaded to another, one leads to another and leads to another. And as you said, the water goes to substation, transport gets affected, roads get blocked, and then the recovery and interventions get slowed down or completely blocked. And in fact, in the project, we looked into whether at the depots put in different parts of the network, are they in the right place? What are those hotspots? Where do we need to put them or not to put them, basically? And this was something that the operators need to liaise. One of the challenges was around institutional data sharing challenge, they were not communicating with each other. The, let's say, asset failure strategies or maintenance strategies of 2 organizations, they were not talking necessarily together around that.
Because normally utilities, they will manage their own infrastructure separately.
Absolutely. And you would be amazed. That's exactly around the table we were having discussion, and then let alone the data sharing aspect, which came as a big problem even in this project, that without that conversation, if the depot, for example, for energy networks, been located in an area which is a hotspot critical so for transport system, you wouldn't put that in somewhere that makes the access impossible during the crisis. And exactly in a more holistic, joined up thinking, you wouldn't have planned that way. And that exactly was the point of it. And then that's exactly what we did. We tried to map and find those critical zones when these failures happened and propagated. These areas that you should or you shouldn't put your depots, your recovery plan in those places. So that was the whole idea of it.
And in a way to bring these different stakeholders together, that's why you developed the RVDSS, so that they can then engage in more dialogue and understand the interconnections. So give me a quick overview of the RVDSS system.
Yeah, we submitted a bit to look into how we frame this interdependent assets failure in the context of infrastructure resilience. We got the funding, and we had 3 industry partners from water sector, from energy sector, and from transport sector. The funding wasn't very big, so we decided to limit this to these 3 sectors. And the project called RVDSS, which the idea was to develop a decision support framework that helps understand how failure spread or propagates across interconnected infrastructure systems. We quantify both their vulnerability and their resilience and design smarter, more collaborative solutions that improve resilience. So what we did, because the problem was very complex in that system, and again, bear in mind, the idea was we come up with a web tool that the operators could play with different parts of the network, could fail any asset that they want, and then see to what extent it's going to be propagated, which part of the network will be affected, and then they can plan and prioritize accordingly. But because the problem was very complex, you need to find a way to explain the logic and your method to your project partners, to industry. And again, it is complex. What we did, we planned, first of all, simplified that as like a benchmark, a spreadsheet benchmark, to test the methodology on that benchmark. What we did, we picked up a totally made up network of water, energy, and transport. We modeled this network as nodes, links, and flows. So simplified the entire thing, all three networks as nodes, links, and flows, which kind of enabled us to monitor that propagation analysis that we want. Then we simulated the failure propagation, means we started failing nodes. I don't know, a pump fails, for example, or a train station is shut down, how it's going to affect that. When we measure the impacts or the consequence or the PI we define, number of users being out of service. But again, we can imagine these KPIs could be broader, much more comprehensive, including more impacts. In other words, you could measure the impact of these cascaded failures. And you could see which part of the network, especially, you're going to get more users out of service.
Okay.
For vulnerability, to quantify the two drivers, vulnerability and resilience. We considered vulnerability as the worst performance drop you can get, or maximum numbers out of service. And for resilience, we considered other factors. We drew a functionality curve and we did some measurements over there.
It's one thing understanding the vulnerabilities and what happens when the cascade of failure occurs. And so you've kind of showed that through the RVDSS, and you can model that with quantitative evidence. But I guess to really understand then how to improve the system, perhaps define for me what is resilience in infrastructure in this particular context.
First of all, the whole essence of resilience looks into the fact that we accept failure as part of the system. And what it does, in fact, resilience, try to minimize magnitude and impact of that and plan around speedy recovery from that failure. In other words, it takes, instead of a fail-safe approach, reliability, 19th century, we don't want systems fail. We accept that failures for various reasons happen. It's climate change, multi-hazards, urbanization, lots of uncertainties around that. We accept that this may happen. So in other words, it embraces the concept of safe fail approach. So that failure is part of it. And the failure is translated in the context of systems in terms of loss of functionality, how big the failure is going to be, how long it will take, how rapidly it fails. So if you imagine that, again, engineers, we would love to put it in some functionality curve, basically, that over time, this goes down. And resilience, what it does, tries to, in a sense, to minimize this duration of being in that failure mode, the magnitude of that, sometimes the frequency of that, and then try to minimize that and that failure. In other words, provides intervention for a speedy recovery to go back to original states if you define it in the context of an engineering system or a system. So that's the whole point of it.
I guess to illustrate it, and a lot of these famous discussions and frameworks also, key name C.S. Holling in 1973, I believe, published a paper on resilience. And there is a difference between ecological and structural resilience, but I guess you can picture it as a ball inside a bowl. And every time the ball moves, that's a stressor. So maybe a flood, or maybe, something else that we, I guess we are accepting. But essentially resilience is the system's ability for the ball to come back to the center and to basically stay still, the stability itself.
Absolutely.
Interestingly enough, ecological resilience, which is also used, is slightly different because it focuses on a more dynamic thing. There can be many balls and the ball can jump from one ball to the other. But the key is that it survives at the end, to put it simply, so that it doesn't completely go extinct in ecological sense. So I guess, we want to design for a certain level of dynamism, which in interdependent infrastructure is especially tricky. But we also want to ensure that the damage done is recoverable, it's not critical. And of course, in engineering terms, we often try to avoid loss of life.
No, absolutely. And yes, there are sort of distinct features between when we talk about infrastructure resilience, yes, and the ecological one, which accommodates, tends to be more, as you said, dynamic and embraces that regime shift that may happen.
Yeah.
Okay, if it finished, it enters another phase and it still survives and continues to function in another way. Well, for engineering systems, obviously, is more rigid, and we tend to keep the functionality within certain limits or standards or level of service we define for that.
Yeah.
But the essence of that is that it embraces that loss of performance, that, let's call it failure, and trying to minimize that impact of it in many ways as much as possible with different interventions.
And so your decision support system, as you've explained, quantifies the vulnerabilities, and we understand the cascading failures and where these failures could occur, which is incredibly powerful. And so how do you then bring the resilience discussion into it? Is it also quantitative, or is it more bringing the stakeholders together and allowing them to discuss ways that they can recover the system and build resilience?
Yes. Well, basically, for the network, what we did once the network developed for the case study area. And as I said, the two measures, both vulnerability and resilience, were quantified. Based on that, the function curve that I talked about, we measured vulnerability as the worst performance drop. In other words, shows how susceptible to that stress you are. And also resilience, in a sense, based on the functionality curve. It still looks into that area in the functionality curve, how it changes over time, and we measure that based on loss of functionality over time. So from the moment it happens, from the moment it recovers. And again, we monitored that functionality in terms of, as I said, and in this project, in terms of users being out of service. But carefully designing that network in terms of what is node, what is a link, and what our definition is very important in that sense. What is important, Peter, around when you analyze the network, if you imagine this system in a real life context, failures don't happen one at a time. You may imagine an urban area, failures may happen at the same time, sequential, it can come in different shape and form. Single failure you may have double failure. Double failures may happen at the same time, maybe happen with the time gap, maybe one after sequential, one after the other. And you may have concurrent failures all over the network. So you can imagine how complex this can become. This is what exactly we did. We tested the network on one at a time failure in network, two failure at a time, three failure at a time, the whole network. What it did, it mapped us different parts of the network.
Sounds like life. I mean, when something goes wrong, everything goes wrong at the same time.
Absolutely.
Or when it rains, it storms.
Everything, it seems that all are falling down together, everything falling. And that's exactly what we observed. We mapped this and we found the most critical parts of the network. That means users in those areas were more stressed during this time. But what I would love to mention is, as one of the key takeaways of this, an observation we had. Yes, more interdependency, more dependency makes you a bit more vulnerable because the number of connectivity goes up, and then any failure happens. It goes up. But at the same time provides an opportunity for shared intervention, subject to tackling that communication collaboration we said. Shared intervention across different sectors, it can dramatically improve that recovery and reduces that cascade. In other words, can improve resiliency. That shared intervention is a key thing.
So it can go wrong quicker, but it can also recover quicker.
Quicker, exactly. That shared intervention. So perhaps one intervention strategy for asset operators, utility sector, and all of that could be some intervention strategies or maintenance strategies for interdependent assets. Both networks can get an understanding when those particular assets fail, partially or fully, then what happens? And sometimes, I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of multi-hazards approach. And that was the vision we had in the structural project I did with David Butler, Project Safe and Sure, that looked into failure in the system at the system level. Means regardless of what the source of the threat is, what's causing the problem, it can be quite complex. It could be multiple at the same time, but they're always at the system level, let's say water network level. They can be defined into certain, let's say, failure states. which is easier to capture and tackles that uncertainty. That was the approach we took in this project, basically.
Define for me the multi-hazard approach, because listeners might not be familiar with it.
That's the approach that in a built environment, the approach that says that hazards or threats or stresses, chronic, could be anything. In real life, they do not happen in isolation. Usually they are combined. They can happen at the same time. And when they're combined together, they create a situation that is much worse than when they happen in isolation. It is difficult to predict them. A lot of uncertainty gets involved with them. And what is translated gradually when you're dealing with a different system, with different infrastructure, it will be translated into the fact that it is difficult and hard to predict them. We need to prepare ourselves for that scenario. And I think one of the arguments of resilience goes around that when that multi-hazard happens, it's difficult to predict, lots of uncertainties. So let's focus on the system and pick it up from the moment it affects the system. It is easier to capture and catch them out there.
So rather than focusing on where the hazard's going to occur, you focus on where in the system you can make it stronger or more resilient.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I guess from all this, it's one thing that shapes you and your career as well is you didn't just gain technically in terms of experience, but you also gained in particular at the institutional level, understanding and creating work that can impact that in a more practical way, bringing the stakeholders together. And this in a way also slowly led to the emergence of none other than the topic of nature-based solutions as well. And so given that we haven't had nature-based solutions on the show for quite some time, I thought let's usher in the topic again with my favorite question, which is, what's your preferred terminology? Do you call it nature-based solutions or sustainable drainage systems? Because I've seen you use both.
Absolutely. There is not an absolute answer to this. It's interesting because I was looking into that and I'm teaching a subject on that to my students, different terminology, different applications. Yes, I do. In fact, sustainable drainage system, I'm an engineer. I would approach this from an engineering perspective. And sustainable drainage system is something well-defined, well-framed, in my view, in an engineering context, in a sense. But I would love the umbrella, I should acknowledge the umbrella concept of nature-based solution, which is not just engineering, it's broader than that, brings ecological and all of that. I think it is fair to give it this umbrella definition or label of NbS, but I certainly see SuDS as a big subcategory under NbS. So maybe not preference, but yes, my work is very much, I'm an engineer, I'm not an ecologist, obviously. My job very much focused on the SuDS. Again, my background is on the wastewater and drainage side, so naturally I think I am very focused on sustainable drainage system.
Okay, I see the preference. Also the preferred term in the UK, but I guess you've also worked in collaboration with people in India and Brazil. What terms do they use there?
Very good point. The team that I am working with, of course, they collaborate with other parts of the world that they tend to use other types of terminology. So it's quite mixed. Water sensitive design, they use LID, I've seen, depending on if they collaborate with the teams in America. But SuDS is something that in the works I've done with Brazil and India through 2-3 projects I've done. SuDS was the terminology we used for granular research because that was what we were doing. But generally speaking, gradually as we formed more of an international teams and all of that, gradually the term NbS came because we don't just have engineers, we have a multidisciplinary team. It seems that NbS is the term most people are comfortable with.
Definitely. So we had this long discussion about interdependency and resilience. And at some point, the topic of nature-based solutions or SuDS seen as climate resilient solutions or climate adaptive solutions. That, of course, can only support the resiliency argument because now with a dynamic system that can recover quickly, if we can somewhat decentralize and add additional benefits through the power of nature, then I guess it's a no-brainer, right? And is that sort of the same rationale that brought this topic into your research? Because you were very focused on more critical infrastructures in the early stages of your career.
Absolutely. This came when As part of the PhD, and again, back in the postdoc project I did back in Exeter, I was very much focused on the optimization of integrated urban wastewater systems, which obviously drainage is part of that. Lots of analysis, risk analysis around water quality compliance, and gradually that notion of just by optimizing design and operation assets, typical mechanical assets, may not be sufficient enough or will not be sufficient to meet all the requirements as the dynamics of the environment dictates, rain changing, temperature changing, and all of that. So this alone is not enough. And the idea of having multiple benefits by doing that emerged. I don't know, if you want to control an X volume of water or flooding somewhere, yes, one solution is make a big concrete tank, put all the volume in one tank, and that's it. From an engineering flood control, your job is done.
Yep, true.
But does it offer any other benefit? And I think that's where the shift of minds and approach is happening in practice, that we shouldn't be prioritizing the most straightforward, easiest solution. We need to look at multiple benefits, solutions that offer more than just one benefit.
Yeah.
And I think that was where I picked up of the concept of SuDS and those decentralized sort of concept of source control, demand management, and all of that.
And to remind listeners of the concept of SuDS, and we've had this quite some time ago, but it's the 4 key words: quantity, quality, amenity, and biodiversity. So the multifunctionality of these kinds of nature-inspired, nature-based solutions. And of course, there's many other benefits that they can offer, but I guess these 4 broad keywords encapsulates that quite extensively.
Absolutely. It tends to walk away from that hierarchy approach that primarily initiated with flood control or flood management at the time, and then gradually embraces other aspects. And then more we're getting involved in it. And I think that's true. So we applied for one of these fundings. It was like a brokerage, it's like a workshop that Royal Academy of Engineering in the UK organized, which the idea was bring different people, different researchers from around the globe to discuss around the climate change and adaptation around that. And which I met some of these partners in Brazil and also in India in that event in Cambridge. And that was the moment that we sort of brainstormed around common grounds. Flooding was an issue. Water and sanitation is connected for them in Global South. And then the whole concept of SuDS, nature-based research, was something we all found common interest in that. We submitted funding. Again, we applied for one of these calls called Global Challenges Research Funding, which looked into this. And primarily at the time, we focused on water quality and pollution. We had case study in the state of Sao Paulo, in a city called Sao Carlos. It was areas with steep trains and then developments in those areas were those informal settlements. And it's interesting, the 2 sides of the valley. In one side, you get in these informal settlements, and then the other side, you would get variegated communities. But they were sharing a stream that gets flooded during the rainy season. It was around February time. I remember I was there. In, 48 hours of rain came down in 50 minutes, an hour or something. I had never seen something like this before, how quickly it was like a bowl. The whole roundabout was downstream of those roads got flooded.
That's crazy.
It was crazy. Water traveling fast. 3 things came to my mind. First, the streams extremely altered by concreting the channel. So a natural massive river concreted, so water traveling fast, lower capacity.
The classic engineer designing for efficiency.
Exactly. Only engineers do the design for the efficiency. Extremely, the main channels were unmaintained. Even when there were intervenes and all of that, they were unmaintained. Lots of branches, trees fallen, so blocking the way, so water coming out quite a lot. And again, development around the areas that shouldn't have developed completely in flood zone. So lots of factors together led to that. So in that project, we collaborated with University of Sao Paulo, based in Sao Carlos, with a number of partners from local authorities and environment agencies, civil defense, and all of that. And we looked into, can we do some source control, looked into some SuDS or source control options in here. Of course, you've got 2 communities with completely different setting, one informal settlement, the other gated. And we looked into that. Policies, regulations at the time were allowing or demanding maybe one type of SuDS could be implemented, that they prefer to have some something like permeable pavement. But the notion was something they were willing to pick up with the council, with municipality. We looked into a number of options, 4 or 5 options at the time. We tried to optimize what the best solutions are. We looked into flood resilience, water quality resilience, and cost of it. There wasn't any document that looked into details of the cost of SuDS, and including maintenance and all that. So we used some documents from the UK. And then, we used a genetic algorithm to optimize where the best options are, how we can fit them in. What we left out were the social factors. What we called them, we enveloped them as a quality of life index. We reassessed our best engineering resilience solutions with those social factors. And you would be amazed that many of the best solutions that we thought is going to do the job for the others were not necessarily the best.
So essentially, they saw the appeal of nature-based solutions, or SuDS, because I guess, once you have a massively urban sprawled area and parts of it informal, it's very hard to build central infrastructure. But they were also quite narrow-minded because they were only looking at one particular system. You went in and actually tried to look at a multiple collection of them. And essentially, you had, a good spread of different options for different types of urban forms and urban districts.
Absolutely. And what is, Peter, interesting is that, for example, one observation, we considered rain barrels, like source control measures, as one of the means to do that. When it comes to those informal settlements, how you're going to implement, how you're going to buy in the communities, that's not an easy thing.
Of course, because then they would have to be responsible for maintaining it, or at least some kind of arrangement has to be made.
And this is something that you need to bear in mind, that maybe an option like I don't know, rain barrel or rain harvesting sounds a bit more simpler to look after. So my point was using a multi-objective lens from the outset is a must, and it needs to include and factor these social aspects into the communities and users from early on. That wasn't something that was practiced as, a very engineering focus, and we were trying to shed light on the fact that this must be done.
And I guess previous studies, you also identified key barriers to the widespread adoption of SuDS, using these two terms interchangeably. But hey, we listeners by now should know the trend here. But in particular, a lot of knowledge gaps exist in terms of design and maintenance standards, long-term planning. I guess with, informal settlements, it becomes challenging, but also lack of dissemination and knowledge, incentives, and in particular, the reluctance to change as well. And so you mentioned this was a fairly detailed study, but it did miss a bit of the social side. But somehow that is progressing as well through your work there.
No, absolutely. Taking more holistic approach, what we call it here, like a catchment level partnership, that kind of decision, that any decision made for upstream will affect the downstream and vice versa. So these are the things that you need to factor in. And that short-term thinking gradually is a culture change, short-term thinking that paves the way towards more of a longer-term thing. And this longer-term thinking, this should become a culture in the communities and also for the stakeholders and decision makers. That vision shift is absolutely a must, that they see drainage and SuDS not something nice to have, as something that you should have. It must be, in fact, part of the planning from the onset.
Or a critical infrastructure, to bring back in the key term we were using, and I guess infrastructure that we seem to pay more attention to anyways.
Absolutely. Critical infrastructure.
Which brings me to an interesting question that sort of ties the two topics together. So we discussed interdependency. And nature-based solutions are multifunctional, meaning they deliver the quality, quantity, amenity, and biodiversity benefit. So wouldn't that mean that these nature-based solutions are in themselves going to be, very critical, especially if they fail? Would they create much larger vulnerabilities? What's your argument to that, looking at it in the resilience lens?
This is what I call it, and I changed the language. There was a project we did, and again, this comes at the back of a wide range of conversations we had with our local regional partners here in Essex in the UK, that it's a fastly growing area because it offers multiple benefits. Lots of disciplines from different angles would approach nature-based solutions. So it has made its way towards our standards, to our regulations, and all of that. One concern I share personally, as you touched on that, is around understanding the long-term performance of this system. If they are going to be part of, labeled as, we appreciate that now they are a new set of critical infrastructure. They play an important role in tackling a lot of challenges. So therefore, like any other infrastructure sector, you try to understand how under long-term scenarios, how they function and what we do about them, and how we tackle the challenges. This is the same story. One concern I have is that, do we know enough about them, how they function in long-term? Because it is it's still complex. It's not just an engineer, just part of it. Lots of other factors get involved, from ecology, geology, meteorology, on the social aspect, planning aspect, regulations, and all this. So, do we know enough? Do we have enough evidence to know they function as they should in the future? Do we need to intervene? If we have to, then when, how, where? And a concern I have is that I am not sure. We don't have enough evidence. For example, we implement, SuDS for new developments in the UK, but adoption and maintenance is a big problem. Who adopts? We have multiple adopters. Cost plays a key role, and also in the maintenance of it. Do we have enough skills? How we do it, when we do it? These are the things that I think we still need to study and to make sure we're not shifting the problem, as you said, from one location to another, from one time to another. So many problems we have in infrastructure sector are legacy problems, short-term thinking, decisions without thinking of a longer-term resilience. And I'm concerned that we were repeating the same mistake here, creating legacy problems for the future.
So I guess work's still in progress to fully understand it.
Absolutely.
But I think would certainly make a very interesting topic for looking at resilience and interdependency with also the existing infrastructure.
And I should tell you, I have a PhD student I'm working with that he tries to look into interconnectivity of SuDS with other urban systems.
Oh, fascinating.
Yeah, he is looking into also bringing that net zero vision into this space in terms of how SuDS helps with that net zero vision in terms of sequestration, in terms of carbon avoidance, or in the whole life cycle of things, which is an interesting thing to look at. But mapping that interconnectivity was an interesting exercise. It's a work ongoing, but I agree with you. Wherever I look at these days, it's just lens of interconnectivity and interdependencies is everywhere with me. And when you look at it, and we for sure need that, and in the context of NbS too.
Yeah. And as part of the work you're doing, you are looking into still the UK, Brazil, where you've already established quite a bit of research, and through partnerships in India. And I had the fortunate chance of attending a workshop you organized back in December, which I thought was fascinating because you compared the three different contexts. But tell me a bit about what are the key differences, but also the similarities that these three highly different urban contexts share as far as designing nature-based solutions or SuDS are concerned.
What is interesting is that those collaborations we did around NbS and SuDS with Brazil and with India, something that I would love to mention before getting to a point is that at the back of those projects we did, we created some, what we call it, living labs, but they were the case studies over 2-3 summer and winter schools, again in India and also in Brazil, in Sao Paulo in Brazil, in Chennai in India, that we came up with some case study areas. In case of Brazil, there were 3 favela communities by the river that they were getting flooded each year during the wet season, washed off and caused a lot of human loss, financial loss, and all of that. So 2-3 years of collaboration of the lead partner in Brazil with those communities, building trust to be able to collaborate with them on the main issue, in collaboration with municipality, which was a fascinating exemplar collaboration. Maybe it's the subject of another time to discuss, to build that trust with those particular communities. So you need to be inclusive around what kind of community, understand the community you're dealing with, and that vulnerability that they have. But working with those ones, that how with the help of NbS, which is not going to transfer in concrete blocks because they had developed some life around those rivers, which happened to have nature around there too. So it wasn't dramatic change, but at the same time could meet the requirements of flood strategy for the city, but gradually managed to work with those communities and implementing NbS with those communities. So that vision, those projects were acknowledged by municipality. The team there now gradually has developed collaboration with decision makers in the city to acknowledge the fact that how implement NbS and better drainage as part of the planning of the city and include those communities. So that was the living that we really wanted to tell the story. So one of the case studies, the Brazil case study in that workshop was about one of those favela communities that you're dealing with wide range of challenges. There's not a one-size-fits-all solution to that. You need to think about some adaptive solutions to go. Same story with India, that drainage and sanitation are quite intertwined together. And again, looking into communities, areas with high density of population. You don't have many spaces, but you think about some retrofitting solutions that collectively can make a difference to the neighborhood. And again, that was another case study. We have similar sort of flooding during wet season and monsoon time around those areas, especially again, high density areas. So it has its own requirement. And also the UK case study was one of the latest one, obviously, that you were in that table we discussed.
I was in that table, yeah.
Yes, with the rich heritage history that happened to be in a flood zone, and then tackling the flooding in those areas. Not an easy thing, not an easy decision to make. You faced a lot of constraints around regulations and the character of the area and reluctance of the communities to move out and things like that.
You gave us a real headache with that case study. And
yes,
I guess it was perfectly chosen to complement the high density areas of the other tables with Brazil and India, because, even though it wasn't as high density, you practically could touch the land because of heritage constraints.
Absolutely.
Which it just highlights how, even though these kinds of systems are very versatile, they will encounter a lot of space conflicts. And oftentimes you have to be creative about how you end up solving it.
Absolutely. I mean, the first decision shouldn't be the easiest one, the most accessible one. It less happens that you end up with that way. But yes, in many areas in UK, you end up with that situation that there are constraints around the land, around the character, feature, heritage of the site. And it's not just that sometimes you've got ecological, environmental constraint. Working around those constraints, I would believe, is much more challenging than, and sometimes the technicality aspect is not that problem. Those constraints make it a difficult thing to do. But yeah, these are the case studies. But the idea was to shed light on, are there anything we can learn from each other? North and South can learn from each other. If we look at this, the challenges around climate, flood, drought, heat waves and all that is a global challenge. These are all grand challenges which comes under. Yeah. And the idea was to listen to each other and see what we can learn.
So if you had to sum it up in one key lesson or the most important lesson that we can learn from each other, what would that be?
Very good point. I would say for us, maybe learning between North and South is most productive when it challenges assumptions. Southern cases, they normalize adaptability and spatial compromises. Mm-hmm. So the willingness to adapt and all of that seems a bit more. Living with water, historically sometimes they have. And also South-South exchange also important to maximize those conversations. They proved also equally valuable. That's what we discovered. Like these phase approaches that Brazilians apply, India case study try to take on board, combining immediate risk reduction, for example, where housing-led relocation. That's exactly what happened in Brazil. And then they were discussing with India on all ecological survey that they need to do. And also India's explicit that population density and service integration. Again, they are also were binding constraints that that linkage sort of acknowledge and exactly offering same resolution to the case study in Brazil in some areas. It is indeed the case. So acknowledging these regulations, social aspects, ecological aspects was something that I think was bold and present.
In all three.
In all three.
Yeah. And so what exciting things are you going to be working on in the near future, and what's in store?
Fantastic. Yeah. What we have done, the good news that we've got with Brazil case study news came that my colleague that announced that they are now part of the town hall, they call it, but technically the municipality that makes decision around drainage planning at the city level. So the case studies we looked into that now accepted as a living lab that they can be piloted for various things. So it's been a cultural shift. We're so pleased with that.
Amazing.
And listening and supporting. That's exactly what we wanted. And also a lot of opportunities we can learn from them, especially when it comes to higher temperature, heat waves and all of that, how historically they've been dealing with that, considering now where I live, for example, UK, you get more prolonged warm days or hot days. So how best we can tackle that. There's a lot to unpack in those conversations between us and them happening. And hopefully we can bring everybody on board on that. And being part of, again, our working group has now joined the NbS cluster. It shows the momentum that how globally this is important. And I'm so excited about all comes out of it.
And I'm also excited. It feels like we've spent the last few years trying to do that convincing, and people are now open to it. And going into now living labs as an example, as a way of demonstrating, I think is a exciting future for nature-based solutions and SuDS. So I'm looking forward to seeing where you take the work.
One thing we have started, and I think we are progressing with that. I am interested, what I labeled it as SuDS health monitoring, which is a mix of computational and experimental work to create some accelerated failure or fast failure mechanisms that we always know that maintenance is going to be an issue for various reasons. Some of them could be man-made or simply, but some of them could be natural. Understanding those failure states. Again, going back to the same conversation around the system level, what failure scenarios you can identify and as means of inadequate or lack of maintenance around these systems. That hopefully helps us to better understand their future performance. We're trying to create some pilots and demonstration spaces that hopefully in the near future I will be sharing more about that. But yes,
definitely.
Health monitoring is something that we're focused on that.
Yeah, it's a big up and coming trend. So at some point, once that's crystallized, we have to get you on for part 2 to see how that's been progressing.
Fantastic, yes.
Maryam, it's been fascinating covering this broad range of topics and also revisiting NbS because, it's good for me to always get in touch with my core work once in a while on the podcast. But like I do with every guest, I'd love to ask you a few questions that I ask everyone so that listeners can get to know even more about you. And it all starts with the word innovation. So in your view, what does the word innovation truly mean, and how has it shaped the way you approach challenges or opportunities in your work?
So innovation has shaped the way I work by, first of all, to give you my definition, for me, innovation isn't about inventing something completely new. It's about maybe seeing familiar problems, familiar challenges through a different lens in order to create values that it didn't exist before that. So it doesn't have to be always brand new. So new innovation, in my view, happens at the intersection between different perceptions, disciplines, way of thinking, often comes from asking simple, perhaps uncomfortable, unconventional, maybe questions like why we do it, why we do it the way we do, what if we try this or we try opposite. I do the same in my cooking too. I do my conventional way and I happen to mess up the recipes, but I would love to try different things. So it means looking at old problems with new eyes.
And being open to trying.
Exactly. This health monitoring of SuDS came when I was working with another colleagues that constantly working on structural health monitoring. It's a common thing. It's SuDS health monitoring. So innovation has shaped the way I work or I see things by changing how I respond to a challenge. Instead of accepting the constraints as they are and as fixed as they are, I treat them as another opportunity, maybe a design opportunity. For example, in my work with water, use of technology, NbS, innovations, interventions, all of these, they all push me to stay curious or maybe think more collaboratively around different boundaries and use technology as an enabler that allows me to explore and then navigate through these uncertainties, barriers, and all of that. And then for better solutions, better understanding. And this is, I think, where innovation can emerge.
Yeah, very, very interesting.
Yes.
Is there a key moment, book, paper, person that completely changed the course of your career or your mindset?
Thanks to those colleagues that pushed me out of the company to be my own, the CEO of my company. I think now I think about it, that was a change for good. I'm joking. But as I said, the turning point, parents, my mom and dad, always, they are the rock of my life. The sky is your limit. I had unlimited power to do anything I want and take responsibility. I think I owe them everything I have. That's for sure. But perhaps I was very, as I said, very imaginative. I loved to live in my dreams in my head and all of that. And I was a passionate book reader. I used to pick my birthday present a month in advance, going to bookstore and figure out what I want. I don't know whether you were a fan. I read a lot of books, but I think those early stages of my life, I was very much interested in Jules Verne's books. Jules Verne's, I don't know what I'm pronouncing very well, but oh my God, the kind of a story. I don't know how many, but some of them like a journey to the center of the earth, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea,
80 days
around the world in 80 days. Exactly. Michel Strogoff. What was the other one? The Green Ray. I remember I couldn't sleep. I was sleepless for Green Ray for a few days. So books of that, and then imagining and living in those fantasies was something I was so passionate about it. So they shaped me quite a lot. But Jules Verne was one of those ones that helped me think big.
Yeah, to think broad, big, and explore the world, I guess.
Exactly, exploratory, which I think very much is in harmony with my own character because I discovered things as I go. It wasn't something, single thing I hanged on that. I explored. So they were the ones that influenced me quite a lot. But I would say the single location changed me a lot was Exeter Water Centre, especially working with David and Zoran and Jog, and that team was a single person. That team, that environment changed me entirely, which I think I cherish that for the rest of my life, I believe. I do.
Oh, fantastic. Lots of big moments, but they all shape you. Sometimes it's never a single one. In my case, it's also not a single moment.
Yes.
But the intersection of many.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so time management, of course, is
yes.
My guests love this question because half of them don't want to answer and half of them do. But what tips and strategies can you offer in terms of time management? How do you maintain a balance between your professional and personal time?
No, absolutely. Time management is... We all know that it is a challenging and not an easy thing to do. We all know that. But possibly something I do when it comes to time management. The first thing is that be clear about your priority when it comes. What's the most important thing for you? That's essential to be able to do a proper time management. Mm-hmm. I would like to put something first. Family comes first, I would say. I would say that this age. Perhaps wasn't the case at some times in my life, but family comes first. But the second thing that comes is that get your priorities straight, right? And sometimes be honest about the things which are not in your priority list. In other words, the ability to say no to anything or anyone which doesn't fit that. And it is not an easy thing to say. For many people, saying no is not an easy thing to do. And also, in terms of work-life balance, always put time for your health, mental health, physical health. These are absolutely, is a must. Don't compromise that for anything else. But for me, when it comes to time efficiency, once you prioritize, once you are able to say no and be disciplined, motivation, in my view, is a secondary thing. Most of the time, if you leave it to a human being, you don't feel it. You don't feel it. Don't wait for it. Discipline matters, and discipline drives you in life. For me, days start very early morning. I'm a very early riser, 4 o'clock. I don't want to miss it. We're 4 o'clock, 4:30. I am having my first morning coffee and then drive me to night. The thing is that with an 8 hours of sleep, a third of your life you will be asleep. And I don't want to do that. And I think your body adjusts. I think for me is enough. So usually by 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock in the morning, if that's the time you wake up and all of that, most of the things you can get them done. So if you can get into the habit of having some dedicated, efficient, don't book, no distraction, nothing, it makes a huge difference. And I think for me is the morning, that at the time, as I said, between 4:30, 5 to around 8 o'clock is a reading time, doing some deep work, thinking, brainstorming. I think that helps quite a lot. I would recommend. Some people might be a late evening or late night or something. Find your what you're comfortable with.
They call it a chronotype. So,
Is it? Okay. Then that's it. Yeah.
So what time do you go to bed then?
Usually it's around 10:30, 11-ish.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I'm a huge fan of movies. I would love to watch movies or something.
Okay.
And crime series and all of that. So,
you can sleep after watching crime series?
Yes. Even after having coffee, I can sleep. I think my daytime level sets with a high caffeine level in the body. So may not be the most healthy thing to do. But I think I wouldn't recommend that.
But very nice actionable tips that we can all implement partly ourselves as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What is your favorite childhood memory?
2 things. when I unboxed that Lego, I still can't forget that. And second thing, my dad bought me a bicycle. I was, I think, 6 or 7. 6, I wasn't going to school. 6 years old, which I remember I was the youngest of my cousins. 2 cousins, they were much older than me, and they weren't sharing their bicycles. I was sharing my Legos. They weren't sharing bicycles. And it was a nice Japanese bicycle with baskets and like tiny, teeny, like a small horn, and the Mickey Mouse stickers all around that. And I loved it. And it was something. And then, they had those supports at the back, and you were practicing. And gradually those supports came, and exactly. And then the supports came off, and then you were practicing. Those were, oh my God, it's just heaven. I still remember that. And I still have that bicycle, by the way.
That's awesome. Yeah, first bicycle, it's always a big moment.
It is. It is.
I remember my first bike.
Okay, that's good. That's good.
And so what was one of the most challenging situations that you have ever faced in your career to date, and how did you overcome it?
The most challenging part in my career, I think I've talked about that. Maybe it's a repeat, but that company thing, it was the dream of my career when I started my career. I really, really liked it. I spoke to many young CEOs at the time when we started that. That was a big turning point for me, and I learned quite a lot, but it didn't come easy. It was quite challenging. I was lost for a while. Yeah, that was the most challenging. Of course, personal matters. The loss of my brother wasn't an easy. It changed us as a family, so it was tough. I grew up during wartime, Peter. For 8 years of war, my primary school, and partly to guidance school was wartime, and it wasn't easy. I remember moments we were in classrooms, airplanes coming for bombing during wintertime, dark time, escaping to shelters and all that. Not an easy thing to get for a very young, 7, 8, 9 years old. And we were practicing how to escape to shelter. It wasn't easy, but it shapes you in many ways, your character in many ways. So that generation of war, anywhere, gonna be a generation that they face exceptionally different circumstances, and it affects they're going to live with that with their lifetime. Yeah. But in terms of career, the most challenging part I had was during my PhD, because as I said, slightly shift off the context. You had to step up to the expectations, new language, new country, all those challenges comes with it. I found it quite challenging, but it was a change. All were challenging, but at the same time, they were valuable. I learned quite a lot and developed a lot of capacities around that.
Yeah, you wouldn't trade them for anything. You're happy with what they've taught you. And I guess, for the theme of the episode, how resilient they've made you.
Yeah, absolutely. What I would recommend 2 years ago, was it 2 years ago? 2023, September, Exeter Water Centre celebrate its 25th anniversary. So we all went to Exeter. Lots of people around the globe, alumni and all of that, they joined, and we celebrated that. And I was given a moment to talk about my experience, my journey. I think it was recorded, and all of that is on Exeter Water Centre's website. And then Dragan and Godfrey talked about how Exeter Water Centre created basically the storytelling around how it worked. I would suggest, if anybody interested or listening and knows that place, it would be interesting to listen to how such a world-leading place is born basically, and then developed. David, Slobodan and the others talked about it. But
we'll definitely find information and put it in the show notes.
That was an interesting experience. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And so what advice can you offer for young professionals starting out, whether they want to be CEOs or researchers?
Many things. Younger ones, I would say, learn to be comfortable with not knowing. It's okay when you start not knowing. That wasn't something that I was comfortable with when I started. And it's okay if you don't know what you want to do when you start. But don't stop from exploring. I say this because I was one of them. Although I knew I wanted to be a CEO, perhaps I needed a bit more experience. I regretted at the time why I did that. But now when I think about it, I think it should have happened. Without that, I wouldn't have learned what I've learned. But again, learn to be comfortable with not knowing. And it's okay sometimes to get failed. What's important is that how you come back. So these so-called failures are your friends, and it's okay not to feel okay time to time. Give it time. It takes time, but be comfortable with that. Collaboration is your superpower. Every single person is a window of opportunity, same way that you are a window of opportunity for another one. So count on your collaborations. Always look after your connections and your links. And also, again, protect your sense of purpose. Why you're doing. There is a speech it's a TED talk from Simon Sinek on Golden Circle speech is called. And it talks about why, what, and how different companies like Apple and the others approach that. I would recommend, if you haven't watched it, that's on YouTube, you watch it. It's about protecting why you do what you do, which gives you that driver. And again, work out what you want and why you want it. And no worries if you don't know that. Just keep going. It will emerge. And always look after your family and your personal health. I think that's the advice I can have.
Solid advice that aims to strike a balance and build personal resilience.
Absolutely.
And so, Maryam, as we are nearing the end of this episode, what would you most like to be remembered for?
Oh, that's a very good question. There is sort of a proverb from, I think it's Winston Churchill. It says, we shape our buildings, thereafter they shape us. So I'd like to be remembered not just for problems I solve or for helping others and helping others to see in every challenge, I don't know, in our case, in water, how it can be shaped into something that can change lives for better, right? As someone who helped in the area that I am, who helped communities, anything I leave behind, publications, any ideas, any moments, anything that I leave behind, I would love to be remembered as somebody who made a difference, even a little. Yeah. I think it's very, very important. The legacy we leave behind is about how many hearts you touched and what differences you made to the world. Yeah, I think I would rely on Winston Churchill that we shape our buildings and then they shape us.
Solid philosophy and beautiful. So where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
Yes, I mean, I am in LinkedIn.
Yeah.
LinkedIn, for sure. I am there. And of course, I am on X platform as well. These are the two social medias I am on.
LinkedIn and X.
Yeah.
And we'll definitely put those as well as other topics we've discussed today in the show notes so that listeners can dive deep. But
absolutely.
Maryam, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on, and I really enjoyed our discussion.
Absolutely. Yeah. Likewise.
So like I do with every guest, I always give my guest the final words. So one last message for the listeners to take away from today.
I would love to finish this with, as the topic of this podcast, it comes around grand challenges. I would love to finish it with a poem. It is from Saadi Shirazi, who lived in Shiraz, Iran, or Persia at the time, a poet. I think in the 13th century he lived. And he has two famous poem collections, Bustan, the Orchard, and Golistan, the Golden Rose. And there is a poem there called Bani Adam, means the children of Adam or sons of Adam, which I think you find in the United Nations building as well. It's been written over there. I will read it first in Farsi and then I read the translation, which is a good message to send. It says, Bani Adam اعضای یکدیگرند که در آفرینش ز یک گوهرند. چو عضوی به درد آورد روزگار دگر عضوها را نماند قرار. تو که از مهنت دیگران بیغمی نشاید که نامت نهند آدمی. The translation is, human beings are part of one body. In creation they are indeed of one nature. If a body part is afflicted with pain, other part uneasy will remain. If you have no sympathy for human pain, the name of human you shall not retain. Which I think nowhere this is clearer than in water. A flood in one district, in one area, can become a public crisis in another. A dry river upstream can cause food insecurity in another area, or a polluted runoff in a city becomes a loss of biodiversity in somewhere else. So water reveals our interdependence and that interconnectivity. We discussed it today. So in my work and on this podcast, I think all intervention, anything we discuss, they are helping us to find those pain points in the urban body, if you imagine it, and to respond early, fairly, and help the system to heal together. The goal isn't just technology we use, the models we develop and all of that on their own. But in fact, it's the human and ecological resilience, safe drinking water, flood-safe streets, living rivers, communities. They all can thrive because we act as one body, not isolated parts. And I think it brings us to that grand challenges. I think this is what we need, basically. We are all part of one body.
Thank you very much. And that wraps up our complex, insightful and eye-opening episode with Maryam Imani. For more information on critical infrastructure, nature, planning and failure modes, or just insights on whether you're likely to be stuck in traffic next time it rains, check out the show notes for more information over at tgcpodcast.show. And as always, thank you listeners for tuning into this episode and for your feedback and support. If you are enjoying the show, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this podcast with your family, friends, colleagues, and even fellow engineers. Follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, other podcast channels to stay up to date with the latest releases, or be part of the conversation on Instagram at tgcpodcast_official or our LinkedIn group. If you're curious about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website or social media. Head to petermbach.com, my YouTube channel, Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or Instagram at petermbach87. Give me some feedback or suggest a future guest so that I can keep improving this show. The podcast's intro and outro song is called Starsky by Alex Kieran. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.